How does someone find peace in the middle of a blood feud? What kind of love can forgive murderers and teach enemies to embrace each other? Why did the woman who suffered the most become the saint that others turn to when their own situations seem impossible? And what does it take to forgive those who shattered your world? In an age of feuds and blood oaths, one woman chose peace. This is the story of Saint Rita of Cascia, the woman who forgave the murderers of her family. If you've ever been trapped in cycles of violence or hatred, or wondered whether peace is possible when wounds run too deep, this story will show you that love is stronger than revenge, and that God can make the impossible happen through hearts willing to forgive. Hit like and subscribe for more untold legends of courage, faith, and impossible mercy. In the rugged mountains of central Italy, where medieval towns clung to hilltops like eagles' nests and family feuds could last for centuries, a girl was born around 1381 who would one day prove that love was stronger than hatred. Margherita Rita Lotti entered a world where violence was as common as sunrise, where honor was measured by willingness to shed blood, and where forgiveness was considered weakness. Picture the stone-walled town of Roccaporina, perched high above the valley where Rita grew up in a family known for their devotion to God and their commitment to peace. Her parents, Antonio and Amata Lotti, were unusual in their community. They served as peacemakers between feuding families, mediating disputes that might otherwise have led to bloodshed. From her earliest years, Rita was drawn to prayer and solitude. While other children played war games that mimicked their elders' feuds, she would slip away to a quiet grove where she would pray before a simple wooden cross. Her parents noticed that their daughter possessed an unusual spiritual maturity, often finding her lost in contemplation that seemed far beyond her years. As Rita entered adolescence, she began expressing a desire that shocked her family. She wanted to become a nun. In her prayers, she felt called to a life of complete dedication to God, away from the violence and hatred that seemed to poison every aspect of medieval life. But Rita's parents had different plans. Despite their own peaceful nature, they understood the harsh realities of their world. An unmarried daughter was a liability, and they had already arranged a marriage that would secure Rita's future and strengthen alliances between families. The man chosen for Rita was Paolo Mancini, a member of a powerful but violent clan known for their quick tempers and quicker swords. Paolo was handsome, wealthy, and by the standards of their society, a good match. But he was also brutal, hot-tempered, and completely opposed to everything Rita's parents had taught her about resolving conflicts through patience and prayer. What would you do if your deepest dreams were shattered by circumstances beyond your control? When Rita learned of the arranged marriage, she begged her parents to reconsider. She was only 14, and the thought of marrying a man known for violence filled her with dread. But in medieval Italy, a daughter's preferences carried little weight against family alliances and social expectations. Rita's spiritual director counseled submission to her parents' will, suggesting that perhaps God intended to use her marriage as a means of bringing peace to a violent family. With a heavy heart, Rita agreed to the marriage, viewing it as a cross she was called to bear in obedience to divine providence. The wedding took place in 1397. Joining two families with very different approaches to life. Rita brought to her new household a commitment to prayer, peace, and forgiveness that would be tested in ways she could never have imagined. But Paolo Mancini was about to discover that he had married someone whose strength came from a source he didn't understand, and whose influence would gradually begin to change him in ways that amazed everyone who knew them. Rita's marriage to Paolo Mancini began a period of suffering that would have broken many women. Picture the Mancini household, where violence was considered normal, where disputes were settled with fists or blades, and where a wife was expected to submit silently to whatever treatment her husband chose to inflict. Paolo's temperament was explosive and unpredictable. He could be charming and generous one moment, then violent and cruel the next. His involvement in the ongoing feuds between local families meant that their home was constantly filled with tension as Paolo and his allies plotted revenge against their enemies. Rita endured physical abuse, verbal cruelty, and the constant fear that Paolo's violent activities would bring disaster upon their family. But instead of responding with anger or seeking to escape, she chose a path that seemed impossible to everyone around her. She met violence with gentleness, cruelty with kindness, and hatred with love. Her response to Paolo's abuse was rooted in deep spiritual conviction. Rita believed that God could transform even the hardest heart, that love was more powerful than force, and that patient endurance, combined with prayer, could accomplish what human effort could never achieve. Day after day, year after year, Rita maintained this approach. When Paolo came home angry from feuding with neighbors, she greeted him with peace. When he struck her in rage, she responded with forgiveness. When he brought his violent friends into their home, she served them with gracious hospitality. Have you ever tried to love someone who seemed determined to hurt you? The transformation didn't happen quickly. For years, Paolo seemed immune to his wife's influence, continuing his violent ways while treating Rita with casual cruelty. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, something began to change in Paolo's heart. Rita's consistent love and forgiveness began to work on his conscience in ways that confrontation never could have. He started to see the contrast between his violent reactions and her peaceful responses. Her prayers for his soul, offered without condemnation or demand for change, began to soften his hardened heart. The breakthrough came after nearly 18 years of marriage. Paolo experienced what could only be called a conversion, a complete transformation of character that amazed everyone who knew him. The violent man who had terrorized his family and community became gentle, peaceful, and committed to ending the feuds that had consumed his life. Paolo publicly renounced his involvement in family vendettas and began working to make peace with former enemies. He started attending church regularly, treating Rita with respect and love, and using his influence to promote reconciliation rather than revenge. The change was so dramatic that people throughout the region spoke of it as a miracle. Rita's patient love had accomplished what years of conflict could never achieve: the complete transformation of a violent man into an agent of peace. But just as Rita was beginning to enjoy the fruits of her long suffering, tragedy struck that would test her faith and forgiveness in ways she had never imagined. In 1416, after nearly 2 years of Paolo's transformed life, the past came back to claim him. The feuds he had renounced were not easily forgotten by his former enemies, who saw his conversion to peace as betrayal rather than virtue. Old grudges and unhealed wounds festered in the hearts of men who measured their honor by their willingness to shed blood. Picture the terrible night when Paolo was ambushed by members of a rival family as he returned home from a peacemaking mission. The man who had spent his final years working for reconciliation was cut down by those who could not forgive his earlier violence or accept his transformation. Rita found her husband's body at dawn, his blood staining the mountain path where he had died. The woman who had prayed for 18 years to see Paolo's heart changed now faced the ultimate test of her own capacity for forgiveness. The men who had killed her husband were the same ones he had wronged during his violent years. The murder sent shockwaves through the community, but not for the reasons one might expect. Paolo's transformation had made him beloved by many, and his death was seen as a particularly cruel irony. He had been killed for his past sins, just as he was trying to make amends for them. Rita's immediate response revealed the depth of her spiritual maturity. Instead of calling for revenge or demanding justice, she publicly forgave her husband's murderers. This wasn't a momentary emotional response, but a deliberate choice rooted in her understanding of Christ's call to love one's enemies. But Rita faced an even greater challenge than her own grief. Paolo's death had left her with 2 teenage sons, Giacomo and Paolo Maria, who were consumed with rage over their father's murder. According to the honor code of their society, they were obligated to avenge their father's death, continuing the cycle of violence that had claimed so many lives. What would you do if your children were determined to destroy themselves through revenge? Rita's sons were now the age their father had been when she first married him. Young, passionate, and convinced that honor required bloodshed. They spoke constantly of killing their father's murderers and restoring their family's reputation through violence. Rita found herself in an impossible position. As their mother, she could understand their anger and desire for justice. As a Christian, she knew that revenge would only perpetuate the cycles of violence that had already destroyed so many families. As a woman who had experienced the power of forgiveness to transform hearts, she believed there had to be another way. Her response was characteristic of everything she had learned through 18 years of marriage to a violent man. Rita began praying that God would take her sons' lives rather than allow them to become murderers. It was a prayer that seemed to contradict every maternal instinct, but Rita understood that some things were worse than death. The prayer revealed Rita's deepest conviction, that it was better for her sons to die innocent than to live with blood on their hands. She would rather lose them to God than lose them to hatred. Her prayer was about to be answered in a way that would break her heart while saving her sons' souls. Rita's prayer for her sons' souls over their lives was answered within a year of their father's death. Both Gian Giacomo and Paolo Maria died of illness, passing away without having shed blood in revenge for their father's murder. Picture Rita kneeling beside their deathbeds, her heart breaking with grief while simultaneously filled with relief that they had died innocent of the violence that had claimed their father. The deaths left Rita completely alone at age 36, a widow without children in a society that defined women entirely through their relationships to men. She had no family to support her, no obvious means of survival, and no clear path forward. But she also had something that many people in her violent world lacked: complete freedom to follow God's call on her life. Rita's response to this devastating loss revealed the extraordinary spiritual maturity she had developed through decades of suffering. Instead of becoming bitter or despairing, she saw her liberation from family obligations as God's invitation to pursue the religious life she had desired since childhood. She approached the Augustinian convent in nearby Cascia, seeking admission as a nun. The nuns were impressed by her obvious devotion and spiritual maturity, but they faced a practical problem. Their community's rule required that all sisters come from families at peace with one another. Rita's connection to ongoing feuds made her admission impossible. The superior explained gently, but firmly, "We cannot accept you while your family remains at war with those who killed your husband. Our convent must be a place of peace, and your presence would bring violence to our very doors." Rita understood their position, but she also understood that God was calling her to religious life. If human rules prevented her admission, she would trust divine providence to find another way. What followed was one of the most remarkable examples of practical peacemaking in medieval history. Rita embarked on a personal mission to heal the feuds that had torn apart her community for generations. Have you ever taken on a task that seemed completely impossible? Rita began visiting the families involved in the various feuds, speaking to mothers who had lost sons, fathers who had lost brothers, and children who had lost parents to ongoing violence. She shared her own story of loss and forgiveness, demonstrating that it was possible to break cycles of revenge through mercy. Her approach was patient and personal. She didn't preach about forgiveness in abstract terms, but showed what it looked like in practice. She visited her husband's murderers, bringing them food and expressing concern for their families. She met with their relatives, seeking to understand their grievances and find common ground. Most remarkably, Rita began bringing together members of feuding families for meals in her home. These gatherings started small, perhaps just 2 or 3 people who had been enemies, but gradually grew as trust was rebuilt through shared food and conversation. The breakthrough came when the heads of the feuding families agreed to meet publicly in Cassia's central square to formally end their hostilities. The ceremony was unprecedented. Sworn enemies embracing each other, asking forgiveness for decades of violence, and pledging to work together for peace. Rita had accomplished what seemed impossible. She had healed wounds that had festered for generations, transforming a community torn by hatred into one committed to reconciliation. With the feuds ended and peace restored to the region, Rita finally gained admission to the Augustinian convent of St. Mary Magdalene in Cascia in 1407. Picture this: woman of 43, entering religious life with joy, tempered by the wisdom that comes only through great suffering. She had lost everything the world valued, but had gained something infinitely more precious. Rita's transition to convent life was remarkable for its humility and enthusiasm. Despite her age and the extraordinary experiences that had shaped her character, she approached religious formation with the eagerness of a young novice. She performed the most menial tasks with joy, accepted correction with gratitude, and threw herself into prayer and study with passionate dedication. Her fellow nuns quickly recognized that they were living with someone exceptional. Rita's combination of practical wisdom and deep spirituality made her a natural counselor for sisters struggling with their own challenges. Her experience of forgiveness and reconciliation provided a model for resolving conflicts within the community. But it was Rita's mystical life that truly set her apart. Her hours of prayer were marked by extraordinary experiences of divine union that left visible effects on her physical appearance. She was often found in ecstasy, so absorbed in contemplation that she seemed unaware of her surroundings. The most dramatic manifestation of Rita's spiritual life came during a Good Friday sermon about Christ's Passion. As the preacher described, the crown of thorns pressed onto Jesus' head, Rita felt such intense compassion for Christ's suffering that she begged to share in his pain. Picture the moment when Rita returned to her cell after the sermon, overwhelmed by love for the crucified Christ and desperate to unite herself more completely with his suffering. As she knelt before her crucifix in prayer, she felt a sharp pain pierce her forehead. When Rita touched her head, she discovered a wound that appeared to be caused by a thorn from Christ's crown. The stigmata, the miraculous sharing in Christ's wounds, had marked her as someone specially united to the Savior's passion. What does it mean to love someone so much that you want to share their suffering? The wound on Rita's forehead never healed during the remaining 15 years of her life. It became deeper and more painful over time, sometimes bleeding and always causing intense suffering. But Rita received it as a precious gift, a visible sign of her union with Christ and a constant reminder of his love. The stigmata also served as a powerful symbol of Rita's entire spiritual journey. Just as Christ had transformed the instrument of his torture into the means of redemption, Rita had transformed her own sufferings, abuse, widowhood, the loss of her children, into sources of grace that could heal others. Her reputation for holiness spread far beyond the convent walls. People began making pilgrimages to Cascia, seeking Rita's prayers for impossible situations. Healing from diseases, reconciliation in families, solutions to problems that seemed to have no human answers. But Rita's greatest miracle was yet to come, one that would establish her reputation as the saint of impossible causes for generations to come. During the final years of Rita's life, her reputation for obtaining miraculous answers to prayer spread throughout Italy and beyond. People facing impossible situations, incurable diseases, broken relationships, desperate poverty, came to the convent in Cascia, seeking her intercession. Picture the steady stream of pilgrims who climbed the mountain paths to reach the convent, carrying with them burdens that no human power could lift. They came because word had spread that Rita of Cascia could obtain from God what seemed impossible to everyone else. The source of Rita's power was not mysterious technique or special privilege, but something much simpler and more profound. Her complete trust in God's love and her willingness to unite her prayers with Christ's sacrifice. Having experienced God's transformative power in her own impossible situations, she believed absolutely that no problem was too great for divine intervention. One of the most famous incidents occurred when Rita was confined to bed during her final illness. A relative visiting from Rocca Perenna asked if there was anything she could bring Rita from her childhood home. Rita's request seemed impossible. She asked for a rose from her family's garden in the middle of winter. Picture the relative's amazement when she arrived at the Lotti family home to find a single rose blooming on a bare bush covered with snow. The impossible flower was carefully cut and carried back to Rita, arriving fresh and fragrant despite the winter weather. The miracle of the rose became symbolic of Rita's entire life. The ability to make beautiful things bloom in the harshest circumstances, to find hope where others saw only despair, to trust that God could bring life from death. Another famous miracle involved Rita's request for 2 figs from a vine at her family home, again in the middle of winter. The same relative found the figs growing fresh and ripe on a leafless vine, defying every natural law about seasons and growth. Have you ever needed something so impossible that only God could provide it? These miracles weren't just supernatural curiosities, but powerful symbols of Rita's message to the world: that with God, nothing is truly impossible. The woman who had forgiven her husband's murderers, prevented her sons from becoming killers, and brought peace to feuding families had demonstrated that divine love could overcome any obstacle. Rita died on the 22nd of May 1457, surrounded by her sister nuns and filled with the same peace that had characterized her response to every trial. Her final words were reported to be a prayer of thanksgiving for all the sufferings that had brought her closer to Christ. But death was not the end of Rita's ministry to those facing impossible situations. Almost immediately, pilgrims began reporting miraculous answers to prayers offered at her tomb. The woman who had specialized in reconciling enemies and healing broken relationships continued her work from heaven. Saint Rita of Cascia was beatified in 1627 and canonized in 1900, officially recognizing what countless pilgrims had known for centuries: that she possessed a special ability to intercede for impossible causes. Today, her shrine in Cascia welcomes hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, many carrying requests that seem to have no human solution. Picture the modern sanctuary built around Rita's incorrupt body, where fresh roses are placed daily by pilgrims seeking her intercession. The walls are covered with ex-votos, testimonies of favors received through Rita's prayers, from people whose impossible situations have been resolved through divine intervention. Rita's life provides a model for responding to domestic violence that transcends her historical period. Her patient love and persistent prayer didn't excuse Paolo's behavior or enable his abuse, but created conditions for genuine transformation. Modern counselors study her approach as an example of how spiritual resources can supplement practical interventions in breaking cycles of violence. Her emphasis on forgiveness as a choice rather than a feeling speaks powerfully to contemporary understanding of trauma and healing. Rita demonstrated that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting or minimizing harm, but involves releasing the desire for revenge and trusting God to bring justice and healing. The miracles associated with Rita's intercession continue today, with documented cases of healings, reconciliations, and solutions to problems that seem to have no answers. Her reputation as the saint of impossible causes draws people from every background who have exhausted human resources and need divine intervention. But perhaps Rita's most important legacy is her demonstration that suffering can be transformed into ministry. Instead of being destroyed by abuse, abandonment, and loss, she used these experiences to develop compassion for others facing similar trials. Her wounds became sources of healing for countless people. Rita's approach to peacemaking offers hope for contemporary conflicts that seem intractable. Her patient work to heal generational feuds shows how individuals committed to reconciliation can break cycles of violence that have persisted for decades or centuries. Her mystical experiences, particularly the stigmata, remind us that union with Christ involves sharing both His love and His suffering. Rita's willingness to embrace the crown of thorns demonstrates that authentic spirituality doesn't avoid pain, but transforms it into participation in divine redemption. Modern devotion to Saint Rita includes novenas, pilgrimages, and the blessing of roses on her feast day. May 22. The roses have become her special symbol, representing the beauty that can bloom even in winter, the hope that can flourish even in despair. The woman who forgave her husband's murderers and prevented her sons from seeking revenge continues to inspire anyone trapped in cycles of violence or hatred. Her life proclaims that love is stronger than revenge, peace more powerful than war, and that God can make roses bloom in the snow of human suffering. From the feuding mountains of medieval Italy to the global conflicts of the modern world, Rita's message remains constant. No situation is too impossible for God, no heart too hardened for grace, and no wound too deep for divine healing. The saint of impossible causes reminds us that miracles happen not when we demand them, but when we trust completely, that roses bloom not when conditions are perfect, but when love is strong enough to defy every natural law.